Basically, as you know, I'm sure this has been a time of sort of racial awakening and reckoning in the United States. And so this year, we felt like was a good time to sort of write our paper because in the aftermath of these killings, which have been happening for years and years and years, something changed, something shifted, and now there is a sort of attention on these issues of injustice and police brutality that have been taking place in the United States. There's an attention like almost like never before. And so now is as good a time as any to sort of speak out in as many ways as possible to sort of keep the conversation going, to make sure that the attention stays on these issues, and to also bring to the forefront issues of injustice and inequality, exclusion in other areas of society and of our lives. And so as academics, we really felt like an important contribution to that conversation would be the conversation around academia, around Black women's contributions in academia and in academic circles. And so that is really what inspired us to write our paper. So I can just go ahead and share my screen and go ahead and get started, and hopefully when Daphne gets back, she can join in.
I'm back, but I don't know how well my connection's going.
Okay, super.
Can you hear me better?
Yes, perfect, crystal clear.
Okay, so good. So, and Joy will just step in again when she needs to. That's great. Thank you, Joy.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see it?
Yep.
All right.
So as Joy mentioned, we wrote this paper because we thought it was a great time to maybe get our white allies and others to join us in this fight for our lives, for our very lives. And we thought we would talk about what's happening in academia. So this is maybe not quite out in the streets, but it is for our very lives and our families and our communities. And we started by placing ourselves historically in a certain tradition of speaking out with whatever resources we had to talk about our condition and to say, yes, this has been going on a very long time. And so we were very happy to see Martin and Rebecca's research also, because they did a lot more of the historical part of it, setting the stage for where we're coming from. And so we talked a little bit about Black women's history of using their resources, and in our cases in academia and whatever other activism we participate in, to educate students and other faculty about what's going on in our lives. But we wanted to say, and it's been going on forever. And so we started with just a short look, a historical placement of us in this tradition, which Martin and Rebecca's paper did a thorough view of it also, and talked about different women and what their roles were. So we started with a quote from Audre Lorde. She did a presentation at Amherst College in Massachusetts in 1980. And she said, "It struck us all. Some problems we share as women, some we do not. You fear your children will grow up to join the patriarchy and testify against you. We fear our children will be dragged from a car and shot down in the street, and you will turn your backs on the reason they are dying." And I think what she meant by that was that not all white people will shoot Black people with a gun, but far too many accept the explanations of the ones who would do this, saying, well, he did this, well, he did that, well, I was afraid of this, well, I thought that was a gun, well, I thought they were, all kinds of just really ludicrous excuses for doing this time and time again. It's been happening all of my life and all of my mother's life and grandmother's, and we know these stories. And so what we saw on television with George Floyd was not something new to us. It seemed to be something all of a sudden new to white America and others, but it wasn't new to us, and we've been saying it. And this particular cop said, and I can do it in front of a camera, and I want to do it in front of a camera to demoralize you and let you know your place, and nothing's going to happen to me. And it hasn't changed. It's always been that way. And so we were struck by what she had written and published, 40 years ago. And we thought we'd start with that. She was an intellectual, an academic, and her statement was part of why we decided to write our paper. Go on, Joy, let's see what we have next. So we said, first and foremost, at the intersection of race and gender, in our country, we are who we are because of our race and gender. And so that's more salient than anything. That matters more to our lives and the lives of any other Black woman in America, no matter who you are, where you came from, what your education level is, what you have done. Your race and gender defines not only who the dominant society says you are, but what you can do, what you should what you should be allowed to do, and what you should even think you should be doing. And so the whole system is set up such that people who are Black women are on the bottom. They should be on the bottom. We have to keep them on the bottom. They should know they're on the bottom. And doing this by decimating families, killing our children, putting limits on our education and jobs and healthcare and just everything. And so we started with a brief history of, we talked about Anna Julia Cooper. And so we picked these women because they were actively known as intellectuals, and they were from different backgrounds, a little bit different backgrounds. They were privileged in the sense that they were able to get educations back during the time of, the mid and late 1800s, partially because they were of immediately mixed heritage, and they had some family connections that would help them as direct descendants of slave owners, like the first generation right there, who did, while they owned slaves, said, well, these children will let them have some sort of education, these female children even. And so they used their resources to try to speak against lynching and to speak against Black people not having an education and access to health care, not being able to vote. Mary Church Terrell was very much a suffragist. Alice Dunbar Nelson was a journalist, and she wrote and taught in high schools and talked about religion and healthcare. And all the while, these women had to fight in conditions where they were also devalued because they were female within the Black community. And so we studied their work some. We're not historians, and we studied their work some. We studied their works in our programs, and also when we were growing up, because or Myrtle and I did, and I don't know about Stella, but I imagine so, went to segregated schools. So we had teachers that we learned a little bit more Black history than other students did. Like in Texas, slavery hasn't been taught to elementary school children. They think that they called Black people here immigrants. And so they didn't want the students to know the horrors of what had happened. And not knowing these things really hinders being able to say, here's what happened in the past, and we're going to work against it, which of course you all know. So we also wanted to bring to the forefront Sabrina Fulton, who's the mother of Trayvon Martin, and she speaks out and out of her deep grief of her son having been murdered. Erica Garner, her father, Eric Garner, was strangled in the streets of New York City by some policemen not very long ago. And he also was saying, I can't breathe, and it was filmed. And the policeman killed him. And his daughter, Erica Garner, came out and became an activist for his cause. And she died of a heart attack at 27. I believe it was last year. Uh, Leslie McSpadden is the mother of Michael Brown, a young man that was shot in the street from a police car um, by some white policemen in St. Louis. And they shot him, and they said they left his body lying in the street for all the Black community to see for many hours. They would let no one come near him or remove him. And then we have this picture of Larcenia Floyd holding her baby George Floyd and looking like any mother would. And so part of our paper and our reason for writing this was, as academics, as Black intellectuals, we want to tell something that's going on happening to us in academia that's part of that larger structure, but also not different from what's happening to these mothers who maybe are in different places than we are. We have, we have Black sons, three of the authors do, and we have seen and felt these kinds of things every time they happen. So we wanted to also say that we and the women before us, we reject the status that is attempted to be imposed on us by the dominant powers that be, because we have to. This is a fight for our lives. We reject it. And so we keep going forward through our pain and sorrow, and but we live here. So basically, we're assigned these places by society with all kinds of justifications: lazy, not capable, less intelligent, all kinds of things. But we have rejected this from the very beginning. And I think Martin and Rebecca's paper brought that forward very clearly. They rejected it and our foremothers have rejected it, because if we didn't, we wouldn't survive, because it is designed to, if you don't accept it, then you get strangled. You get, you can't do this. They want us to accept this position. So we use whatever resources are at our disposal wherever we are, from this location of you are Black and female first, and you are at the bottom, and you should stay at the bottom, know your place. And so we wrote our paper, and then we brought in a little bit more what's happening to us now in academia, how our colleagues and how the system has tried to snuff us in academia.
Okay, and so to contextualize a little bit of our argument before we get into it, we have just a little bit of background information about Black Lives Matter. And so you may all be familiar with Black Lives Matter. And as Daphne mentioned, it really started after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2014. But as we mentioned, our paper sort of came about because of all of the things that have happened in 2020 this year. And so we have this sort of magazine cover of the 3 Black women founders of Black Lives Matter. And just to, again, sort of contextualize this argument and this situation that we find ourselves in. So this year, this dramatic, crazy year has also brought to the forefront these 3 women activists who have been working for the past 5 or 6 years, sort of tirelessly, to bring Black Lives Matter to the conversation and to keep it there. And so one thing that we really felt was worth mentioning is that Black Lives Matter, while it was founded in response to the acquittal of the murderer of a 17-year-old Black boy who was just walking home from the corner store, it has never only been about police brutality. While this is the context through which most people know about Black Lives Matter, a quick perusal of their website and their mission statement shows us very clearly that Black Lives Matter is actually designed to fight against all the instances of injustice that Black people all over the world face. And so you can see these sort of statements that have been made by the founders of Black Lives Matter to explain very clearly what Black Lives Matter is all about, and to affirm the lives of Black people, all types of Black people all over the world, to affirm our humanity, the humanity of Black people, the contributions of Black people to all facets of society, and to give us a voice to really be able to say, we belong here, and we matter. And so because of this, because of these sort of statements, because of what Black Lives Matter was founded on and what Black Lives Matter stands for, we really have said there's a place for Black Lives Matter in academia as well. And so for our paper, first, we give these definitions of white supremacy and of anti-Blackness to further explain the challenges that Black academics in today's academia are facing. You know, these definitions explain very clearly that they are they go against what Black Lives Matter says, right? So rather than affirming our humanity, we face anti-Blackness that disregards our humanity, that is unable to recognize it, and instead has disdain and disregard and disgust for us. And we work within a system that privileges whiteness, that maintains whiteness, and that seeks to advantage whiteness over all of the rest of us, and to the detriment of all of the rest of us, but in particular, Black women. And with that, we go into some examples within our paper. First, touching on the sort of structure and maintenance of hegemony that academia presents.
So first, we wanted to kind of acknowledge we're in an academic environment, and it's a hierarchical, structured environment that all kinds of inequality that fosters it, and it's in a setting. And so here we are as one of the mouthpieces of the system, of a racist system, to perpetuate our structure. And our structure was built on the back of, in the United States, Black slaves, and today, Black housekeepers and Black home health aides and all kinds of service work. And this is where we are relocated through many, many means, and that is keeping the education low and access to healthcare and all kinds of things that really came to the forefront for the dominant groups this year of COVID. And so we always knew it, and we always saw it, and we always felt it. And we felt a little privileged because we're second and third generation children of academics also. And so, but for others, it's more of the same, just generational poverty and all kinds of things. So these unequal relations, we feel, and we have seen that academia just helps to perpetuate it by, as Martin and Rebecca mentioned, not having us represented, but also not having our work represented at all, just not there. And I think part of the reason of that also is because that work often will speak against the system and the power relations. And so maintaining the privilege and maintaining intellectual ideologies, what work is better, what work is more important, what journals you can publish in, what kind of research you can do. And so I'm an engineer by training, my first 2 degrees, but I wanted to do my PhD research in the business school on the work of poor women of color. And so that's what I did. I studied home health aides, working at worker cooperative and comparing that to other kinds of work environments. But that is not, that's not considered exactly really important work by many. in the business school. And so we've also seen a lot of conscious and unconscious fostering of anti-Black sentiments in the business school, in the School of Journalism, in all different kinds of places. We've talked to other people and we found that we had very similar experiences. And we thought part of the reason is because, for instance, Myrtle Bell, one of our co-authors, is on faculty at University of Texas at Arlington, and her school flew the Confederate flag over the university till 1971. Well, that was 50 years ago, yes, but the university also had the Confederate flag on their rings until the 1980s. And then, two schools, I think University of Mississippi and Mississippi College for Women also flew this Confederate flag till 2015 or 16. And when they said, the schools said it before the state of Mississippi actually, that we don't want to fly this flag because of what it means. And so they took it down just a few years back. And then this year, the state of Mississippi took the Confederate flag down also. And that really surprised, I think, probably just about every Black person in this country, because Mississippi said as late as last year, we're not taking it down. It means something for us. But also then what we wanted to mention is that even though they may take these symbols down, it's in the hearts of far too many people. And the way that people who don't have this directly in their hearts contribute is by shaking their heads sadly and saying, that's unfortunate. Or I wonder if they did that because that person is Black or Black and female, and just moving on, saying nothing. Because when good people say nothing, then those who are not good, they win. And that's what as we've gone through and had these experiences, we've felt that there were far too many good people who just kind of felt bad about it, kind of felt sorry about it, or wondered if it was this reason or some other reason that the other person gave, and just moved on. But we've had some really wonderful support. So we talk about that a little bit going forward also.
And so just to give a few examples of some of the things that we feel in academia have helped, some explicit examples of things that have helped to maintain these unequal power structures. Our paper offers two sort of different perspectives, one by Black doctoral students, these experiences that are perceived as anti-Black, right? And so I won't read them to you, but you can see these are just a few examples that we have pulled out of a sea of examples. And these are some of our experiences, but they are not unique. These experiences of being constantly criticized, of being ignored, of being told your ideas are not good, of being told that your research interests are not valuable. They set the stage for a lifetime of working and learning in an environment that is openly and sometimes not openly hostile toward you, and is designed to be that way to show you that you don't belong and that your presence is not needed, and nor is it welcome, right? And so again, these are our experiences and the experiences of people we know. And we, the three of us and the four of us who wrote the paper, did persist to graduation, but these experiences happen to Black students in academia all over the United States and the world, and many of them do not persist. Many of them have these experiences and then leave academia and decide that their contributions are not worth anything, and so they should go pursue something else. We also have these examples of experiences from Black faculty. So again, people who did persist in spite of this anti-Black sentiment in all facets of academia. Once they get to their goal of being faculty members, they still continue to have these same experiences, this time from their coworkers and their bosses and other people in positions of power within the university structure. So again, these are our experiences. These are the experiences of people we know, but they are not unique in any way. And the list could be, instead of 30 items, it could be 300 items, it could be 3,000 items. And so our part of our inclusion of these instances in our paper is to speak out against them. Rebecca and Martin mentioned that, the groups of intellectuals sort of maintain their hegemony, and they secure their consent by getting people to stay silent. And so part of our writing these and then publishing these instances and making people aware of them is because we do not consent. We do not want to allow this structure to continue, and so we will not stay silent. Instead, we will make it as everybody as aware as possible of these instances. And so we have this, and we sort of conclude, though, rather than, on a pessimistic note, we conclude our paper with a call to action and with some examples of things that our allies have done so far to sort of help us. And I know we're running out of time, so I will be very quick. But first, we have this sort of rejection of complicity, right? And so in our paper, we also include a chart that gives examples of supportive behaviors that those who are allies have done so far to say, we do reject these structures, we do reject this implication that you're not valued here and that your work is not valued. And so these examples, along with some of the other examples that are present in our paper, are things that have really mattered to us in our journeys and have mattered to other Black people in academia over the years. Right? And so some other wishes that we have for those who would be allies, right? Reject complicity, speak out when you see something that needs to be addressed. Put yourself on the line in a situation when a Black person would normally be expected to put themselves on the line. Admit when you don't know something, admit that there needs to be more understanding and more learning, and acknowledge the privilege that you do have and where it comes from, and actively work to break down those barriers and to redistribute the privilege among all the people who deserve it. Right? Be willing to fight alongside us and sometimes to step in front of us and fight when we are too tired to do so. So that is where I will end. Thank you.
Okay, Joy, Daphne and Myrtle, thank you very much indeed. That was a powerful talk. First of all, have we got people who would like to raise questions about the talk specifically before we move into a kind of general plenary to talk about the issues that both papers raise in common? Again, if you can sort of raise your hand either literally or using the chat thing, I'll try and see. Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to both sets of speakers for really very interesting, very stimulating, and for me, importantly, practicable papers with conclusions. I just sent in a private message to Mark that I will have to leave to go to another meeting, but I particularly like the end of your paper on Black Lives Matter there, the calls to action. And I know this is an academic seminar in the traditional fashion, but I would really like to see, and I've asked if Mark and colleagues would please take from this and from the plenary a number of very tangible actions that we can take forward in the school, and that I can certainly also represent across the university, but that we can take forward in the school to make a noticeable difference in the way that people are treated and the way that we develop increasingly a culture where people will, I like that phrase, stand in front of us, will stand together and will call out bad behavior. I had a very interesting discussion with my 22-year-old son last night, who, although being an engineer, has currently got a job delivering with Argos, which is a delivery service in the UK because there are no engineering jobs. He heard somebody who is his immediate line manager talk talking about, I'm not going to use the word, but talking about going to a Chinese restaurant, and my UK colleagues will know what the slang and offensive term for a Chinese restaurant is. And I was very proud that he was struggling. Well, he was struggling. He was saying, I need to alert people to this. I need to complain about this. And I said, yes, you absolutely do need to complain about this. But he's dealing with that. He's standing in front. He's a 22-year-old intern type, minimum wage. And this is his immediate line manager. And he's thinking about, does he go straight to the line manager, or does he go above the line manager? What's the way to do that? But that's the kind of behaviors that we need in the school as well, so that everybody is aware that the attitudes have to change. And that's a place to start. So I'd like to thank the speakers for that very much, and apologize that I will have to leave. I'll stay for a couple of minutes longer, but then I have to get to my next meeting.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah. Becca's got a question.
Well, I wanted to say thank you for to Susan and Mark and Rebecca and Martin for inviting us. We learned a lot. We were here to learn and listen and see where you are and why you did this. So we basically wondered at first, why did they do this? Why did they write this paper? Why did people of those demographics write a paper like this? And so because you're allies, obviously, and you want to bring it to the forefront. And so immediately as we read it, it's quite obvious. But we just expected this kind of dedication to this topic would be someone who looked like us. But maybe we'll take it any way we can. We're happy that you wrote it, and we have learned about some women, some Black women who we didn't know about ourselves, and so we're going to delve a little bit more into what they did there, and hopefully you can take something forth from what we presented. Thank you.
Yeah, Beck, did you have a question? You had your hand up.
Yeah. I don't really know how to use them. So I wanted to ask Joy, Daphne, and Myrtle. I work in American Studies. I'm a Department of American Studies. So we were watching, and given sort of my specialist research areas, there were myself and several of my colleagues were watching events unfold in the US from March onwards, and the murder of George Floyd and others, sort of with real interest. And we felt there was a kind of real sea change. There was a sort of a way in which people were reacting that actually they'd never reacted before like this. And, sort of from, sort of Trayvon Martin, sort of onwards, and, sort of even before, like Rodney King. And I was really interested in this concept of the bystander, sort of the silence element, and wondered how much hope you have that, sort of white allyship has increased, that actually, sort of that actually white America, or some parts of white America, are now willing to, sort of become allies, or at least learn and educate themselves about, sort of the histories of African American enslavement, but also, sort of African American resistance to that oppression. So, I mean, sort of how hopeful are you? I guess it's a bit of a twee question, but I just, sort of, I'm really interested as regards, sort of the hopefulness. Does it feel different?
It feels different. We were very surprised. It's the kind of thing where it's like a public lynching, and it's been happening always, and to no one but Black people, not any of these other types of minorities here, though they get discrimination and called all kinds of things. They don't get the kind of public killings that we have gotten since slavery and before. No one else gets that. And so it's a means of demoralizing the community also. So, and we have lots of white friends and what we think are allies, and you get accustomed to their being accustomed to it and not being willing to do what you think you would do if you saw it happen to anyone else. We think, oh no, there's no way I'm going to see that happen. I'm going to stand in, even if I'm at risk. And they're not doing it. And so you have to get past it, because you wouldn't have any friends. You wouldn't have them maybe help you be in a position to do whatever you will do.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, we're very surprised. And the only thing I can think is that our society is more mixed racially than it was before. And so these are their family members and closer friends also. There's extreme segregation in living conditions, but less so. And extreme segregation in schools, but less so. And so there's more of those who feel that who understand that it's all of us and that we're one and the same and that it will harm all of us. And also COVID.
Yeah.
And for some reason, COVID was there. So we were as surprised as anyone. And as far as being hopeful, I'm moderately hopeful. We've seen our business schools come out with statements that we maybe don't quite believe because of how they looked the other way yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're just hopeful, and we will continue to try to push it forward. I think younger people are there, but there are older people doing it too. And I think it's hopeful that the next generation will be less so. And if they have more knowledge, they will just use it to the benefit of all of us, and the generations of people who are my age when we're gone. Maybe the next generation, maybe your generation will be better. So I'm moderately hopeful. What about you, Joy?
I think one thing that was surprising to me was for how long people remained interested. So in the past, it was a news cycle or two, it garnered a lot of attention, and then something else came up, and that was what people talked about and thought about and cared about. And because of that, people who have been killed in the past have been forgotten before any meaningful change could be done in terms of holding their killers accountable, for example. And this time, protests went on for hundreds of days, with no end in sight. And I think that is very, very different, when I think certain people would have expected that people would move on by now and they haven't, then the question of whether or not people will be held accountable becomes, a question that you can't ask, because people are still paying attention, people are still looking and waiting. And that's something that I don't feel has happened before, and so that I think is new. And I think it means something, and if anything, shows everybody the power of, collective action and collective sentiment toward a different society. And so if everybody can see that the majority of people want change and want to see things be different, then maybe that will be enough to sort of push things in a different direction.
Let's hope so.
Could I add to that, in the sense that I was just, my own feeling is maybe a bit more pessimistic, and just sort of looking at how adept the current hegemony is at sort of adapting to this sort of emergence of a counter hegemony. So you've got the Black Lives Matter movement as it emerged. There was a lot of hope and promise and positivity around it. And very slowly, the hegemony, the sort of white supremacy behind that, managed to construct lots of little holes in it and sort of poke holes. So first it was all lives matter, not just Black lives. And that sort of poked a hole in it. Then it was that Black Lives Matter is violent. It's a threat to your livelihoods. And it was, I think it slowly eroded it sort of stopped the head of steam that Black Lives Matter had.
But that's the same thing they've always been doing.
Yes, exactly. I was going to ask whether you
right.
see that yourself, and whether that filters through to academia for you guys, because you guys are doing this yourself, whether you're starting to feel people poking holes in your arguments and saying all academics matter, or, everyone, and they're trying to poke holes in everything in this way. I wondered if you've experienced that.
No, they're a little more subtle in academia. They you know, they will, the people that who I would say are hardcore white supremacists that I know in my business school would never say that aloud. They would try to let me know it privately. So we're more hopeful for the society maybe than where we're working, at least immediately. Definitely for me. I don't know. I think that the intellectuals with the training are going to try to hold on longer, continuing to do what they do longer because they've gotten away with it and they want to do it. So, you know, I don't trust it for our working conditions immediately. I'm more hopeful for the society as a whole, thereby bringing more change. Yeah, you know, the holes that are poked, that all lives matter, of course they do, you know, but we're talking about these people who are Black, who are killed in the streets, who are lynched publicly in the streets, never stopped. And so that's why we're focusing on, well, they don't want to hear that because they want you to be silent, you know? And so those holes in particular, yeah, that's the president's holes. That's what he would say. But everyone knows what it really means and they know why there's a focus on it. And so we have to be hopeful. We have to be. We have to be some level of hopeful just to keep going forward. You know, I never forgot Trayvon Martin's mother or his family or him. But he, you know, he moved into the background. And so now he's come back forward and his mother was there speaking all along. And so Black mothers haven't forgotten it. So, and that's kind of the reason that we linked it to our day-to-day lives and who we are, saying we're no different than any of the others. This is our life. And so we just have to keep doing whatever we can do in whatever ways that we can, you know, voting and you know, going to, you know, protesting at work, standing out there at work. Yes, you want tenure, but nobody's going to do this but you. And if you speak up, maybe someone will stand up for you or with you. And so we've kind of seen that. So we have to be hopeful.
Oh, I think on that note, it is 3:30 UK time. I don't know whether everybody has to go or whether we're suddenly going to get closed down by the system or something, or whether we can carry on. You know, Martin, I mean, if people want to stay, there's
I'm in control of it. I'm in control of it entirely, so it's not going to close automatically or anything. So it's
okay.
But I think Myrtle, did you have something to say before the end? I think you were trying to speak at one point.
Yeah, I was going to say I'm also cautiously optimistic, and I have some, you know, doubt. And in my B school, there are some who, like Daphne said, wanted to stay the same. Some intellectuals will, you know, do things in a sort of clandestine way. So it's never calling you the N-word, but behaving as though you don't belong. But my school is a majority minority university. So there are more non-white people than white people. And that has transitioned, since I first went there and, you know, about 20 years ago. But we currently in the College of Business, my dean just named me as Associate Dean for Diversity, Racial Equity, and Inclusion. And we had been lobbying for that position for quite some time and never got it. And so when after George Floyd was murdered, you know, he was talking with me and another senior Black academic, there are 3 of us in the College of Business, and you know, about what he could do. And it was on virtual and his eyes just lit. He said, what if I name an associate dean to deal with these kind of issues? And when the title came up, diversity, racial equity, and inclusion, someone said, well, just call it equity because everybody has issues. Everybody, things are, you know, other people will be concerned. And he said to me, what do you think about that? And I said to him, it's Black people who are getting killed in the street. And he said, you're right, I'm sticking with racial equity. And that's the end of it. And that was the end of it. And to me, that speaks volumes to everybody in the college, everybody across campus. We're doing this because of George Floyd. We're not doing this because we're concerned about other kinds of equity. Right now in this space, this is what we're concerned about. And so I have seen some backlash already in my 2 months in this position, but this man, a middle-aged white man, has my back. And so, in fact, stands in front of me sometimes. So that makes me also, hopeful with trepidation, and we have to remain hopeful or else we go under a rock.
And we want to make it clear, we're not downplaying other kinds of discrimination that people get for their religion or that Asians get. Just all of it is bad, but we have to focus on the anti-Black first. Even the gender discrimination, we feel it so badly. We feel it in our communities. We're like, that shows he's out of his mind. What's wrong with him? Well, but we have to focus on it because it's so bad in our community and it's so much worse in our communities. And we will fight it. We step up and we speak up for the others every time we see it. Every time we see somebody being a religious bigot or mistreating somebody who's of Chinese descent or Indian or something, we will say something. There's no doubt about it. It's just that we don't want to, when you look at places of work that say, oh, I'm diverse, we've got 40% minority, and they have 2,000 employees and 3 are Black, something like that. So yes, they're diverse racially and ethnically, but they're still keeping out Blacks. And so we have to we're focusing on the anti-Black racism because it's the one that's, also killing people. And so that's why, that's why she didn't want that diluted because if it gets diluted, then everybody benefits except Black people. That's what we've seen in the past, especially, gender related things and that kind of thing.
Peter, yeah.
Yeah, I was.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. 2 really interesting talks, and I'm going to try and read the papers because I haven't read them before, so apologies for that. I was interested in Myrtle's use of the term backlash, and it reminds me of in the UK yesterday there was a report about the Labour Party and anti-Semitism. And it's often said by people, and the Shadow Foreign Secretary, woman Lisa Nandy, used this term that anti-Semitism is unique because it involves punching up, because there's this perception that it's a group that have power and money. And so historically, there's been this argument that somehow anti-Semitism is different to other forms of racism and discrimination and so on. But the term backlash reminded me of the book by Susan Faludi from the 90s, where she was writing about the backlash against women. And from memory, and this has come back over 25 years ago, one of the points she was making was that the backlash against women was happening because they had gained some semblance of economic, civic, and legislative power, and so on and so forth. So their lives had improved in many respects. Nobody was naive enough to suggest that they didn't still suffer immensely, but there was improvement. And men were having a backlash against women because they had improved and they were a threat. They were an economic and civic threat. And I wonder whether there's any of that within the current situation at the moment, in that you mentioned that the US and the UK to some extent is much more racially mixed and diverse and so on. And when I see some of the people in the UK who are arguing against certain things, there's an actor in the UK, Lawrence Fox, who's recently gone on about almost sort of culture wars and the UK's tradition is under threat. He doesn't say who's it under threat by, but obviously he infers that it's non-white people, etc. And I wonder if it's because he sees them as gaining some power, and so he's not punching down anymore. I don't know if he's punching up, but he's certainly punching sideways at groups that he thinks are under threat, are a threat to him. I wonder whether there's any of that going on in both what we've seen in terms of post George Floyd and the reactions, the attempt to diminish through All Lives Matter and the other discursive tricks and so on and so forth that get used in order to try to destabilize a movement. And I just wonder what your view around that would be, or am I talking complete nonsense?
No, I think you're making a lot of sense, and my reaction to that is somewhat mixed. I think some people want to believe that Black people are getting too much, and there's some level of research that looks at aversive racism and new racism, and they measure the people who think they're getting too much, they're going farther than where they belong. There's a subset of that, but there's also a large subset that says you can't have anything. It's not that we're punching across, we're not even, you're under my feet, and that's where you belong. You don't belong making noise about being shot in the street. This is what should happen to you. And so I think there are different groups of people thinking different things. So for some, there is the backlash that you mentioned, spoken by Felucci. But for others, it's just pure abject racism and that you're getting too much. And so in the history, and Rebecca probably knows this, in the history of America, when Black people, Black communities started doing well, white racists burned them down. There's Tulsa, there's Rosewood, there's lots of communities that you can't have anything. How dare you have a thriving community? And so there is some of that. And so, I think there are pockets of different aspects of hate that show themselves.
Yeah. Can I just add one other point? Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting in the UK because I don't know to what extent you followed the debate around Brexit and leaving the EU and from 2016. And some of the places that were the most in favor of Brexit were those that thought there were so-called minority groups getting things that they weren't getting. And then when you looked at the demography of these areas, many of them were very non-mixed. There were exceptionally high levels of white people living in these areas, and yet they had exceptionally high levels of Brexit voting and high beliefs that others were getting more, people coming into the UK were getting more than they were getting. It was a really weird dynamic around the way they formed their viewpoints. Many of them had never met somebody who wasn't like them, and yet they had these views about what these people were getting compared to them. It was very strange.
Well,
I saw that.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, my field is media, and I think that deserves a mention in the conversation around what people understand, what people are thinking about others who they don't actually come into contact with, on a daily basis or regularly. What people consume in the mass media and in the news, or what purports to be news, really has an impact on how they feel about what's fair and what's equitable and what should be happening in society. And so part of that conversation is really about how is it that groups of others, whether it's immigrants, whether it's Black people, whether it's people who speak a different language, how are they portrayed in the dominant media, and how are they seen? Are they dehumanized? Are their struggles for equality or equity presented as threats to the general population? And if so, then it's almost to be expected that there are going to be people who buy into that narrative and then who run with it, and who really feel as though their lives are being threatened. One thing that I've read about is, in the United States, they something about right now it still is, a majority white country. And there are people who are really, really afraid of the day that white people are not in the majority. And they really feel as though when that day comes, they might be oppressed in the way that other people are oppressed
They have
now.
depressed other people, right? Right.
And
They
so-
assume that people are going to behave the way they have, which is not a good assumption, especially people that have been on the receiving end of it. They feel like maybe they deserve it. That's what I think, so they're worried. They're going to turn it on us. These women are going to turn it on us. These Black people, these Asians, these Muslims, these Jews are going to turn it on us because they deserve it. But yeah, I agree. The media has a big part to play in how people are perceived and treated. And it doesn't matter if it's lies or not. That's unfortunate.
When Joyce said that about the media and what people believe, I thought about this study, and I don't know the exact numbers, but a certain subset of the population, when you ask them, what proportion of the population is Black, and they'll say something like 40%. What proportion is Latino? 40%. Well, then, so that means white people are about 20% of the population, but they believe they're everywhere and they're taking over. But the other thing that, we're thinking about when the population switches, which is nowhere near close to happening when whites are no longer the majority, you still have to deal with the power structures. So even if they're not numerically the majority, they're still in positions of power. And that is something that is a hard nut to crack.
Yeah.
Can I raise the issue of class? Because it's not something that you you hinted at it from time to time, but it wasn't something that you directly addressed. I'm just thinking in a British context, in our history at the time that in the colonies, there were slaves owned by British people until I think the 1830s. If you take the life of somebody, say, working in a cotton mill at that time who was white in the UK, although they weren't officially enslaved, and they had the choice, in theory, to get a job somewhere else or something, if you're working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for virtually nothing, it can't feel much different. Okay, I mean, you see what I'm saying. But even so, in the, I think it was the 1860s, cotton workers went on strike in support of Black emancipation and refused to take the cotton that was being exported from the South and so on. And they saw themselves as having, really strong affinities and a kind of, support for slaves. But I wonder whether there's something going on here that, because in America, Black people are obviously Black, and you sort of represent, in a way, a kind of working class persona, in a way that in the UK, until recently, until really the 50s, working class people couldn't be distinguished by skin color from elite groups. And so, it makes things more complicated in some ways, because I suppose it must be true to a certain extent that, seeing Black skin color is a kind of proxy for making assumptions about class and things that we historically haven't really had in the mainland in the UK. And I wondered whether that's important.
Yeah, of course. That's by design here in the United States that, Black people were, we looked a certain way, and that was how you could identify us as less than. And it wasn't necessarily like that at the beginning. Black people and poor white people worked side by side doing the same jobs. And then when it became apparent that that the United States needed free labor and that they needed a way to separate by class, then race became an issue. And so that is our foundation, that is our legacy, and that's why things are still the way they are. And that's why, as Daphne mentioned, other oppressed groups, can progress in different ways, can progress further, can assimilate in ways that Black people simply cannot. and have not been able to.
And some of them will fight for us the same as we would fight for them. But I think a large number of people have realized how bad it is for Black people, and we don't want to be there. And so they take what they can get and distinguish themselves. And it's really sad to see, just so that they don't get the kind of treatment that we get. And that really, that's not an excuse, but that's, that seems to be what's happening. So at least we're not there,
Yeah, there's some, at least I'm not Black. So I'm not on the top of the pile, but I'm not on the bottom of the pile with the Black people. But back to your question specifically about class. And so there's so many different manifestations and thoughts about what class is. But when we think about class and socioeconomic status and power and education and such, what someone sees with the Black person is Black skin. And they don't know how much money you have in your banking account. They don't know what kind of ritzy neighborhood you might live in. When you go out for a walk in your ritzy neighborhood, the cops are liable to pull you over and ask you what you're doing there. And so in the United States, race trumps class. And, class might help you if you do get arrested and don't get killed on the spot. It might help you to get off if you're a Black person. But a poor white person is less likely to get arrested. Yeah. Well, they're less likely to even get arrested in the first place.
Right.
And so
certainly not shot in their car. Right.
Not shot in their car. Right. And so
they have. Yeah. Right.
I mean, it happens, not that shooting happens very often in the UK, but a friend of mine has quite an expensive looking car, and he plays cricket with a Black colleague who's, on the same team. He quite often lends him the car for various reasons, mainly because this guy doesn't drink and he does. Anyway, if the Black guy is driving the car, he almost always gets stopped by the police, whereas my white colleague has never been stopped by the police for driving exactly the same car.
Did you have
It's very hard to explain that except as overt racism.
It's what it is, right?
Yeah. Becky, you looked as though you wanted to come in.
Well, I wanted to come in on loads of different points, so it's fine. I could have this conversation forever. So talking about, I don't know if you know Claudia Rankine's work, but she's written this really evocative poem, Citizen, which talks exactly about those kinds of issues of the Black person in the United States. As a non-citizen, as being treated as a non-citizen, and the ways in which their dehumanization has been grounded from enslavement through, and also thinking about going back to something that Joy said earlier about the media. And so what we've really not talked about here is the British Black Lives Matters kind of movement, the toppling of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol, and the response to that from the media was like, how dare they, how dare they topple like someone's statue, even though, he stood for, slave trading, he stood for the, captivation, the wrongful oppression of people's lives. So, thinking about the ways in which the media spin things is so important, and particularly in the US. And then coming back to something that Peter said earlier about, and I think Mark, you kind of hooked onto that as well, about class, in the colonial period, indentured servants, white indentured servants, were brought over to the colonies to work alongside Africans on the American mainland. And initially, the status of Africans was never determined as enslaved. It was only when indentured servants began to, because they had an apprenticeship of like 5 to 7 years, and then they were free. So, and it was only when those numbers dwindled coming from the UK, and you know, sort of, and the need for labour increased, that white people thought, well, actually, how are we going to do this? And actually, it was the labour that was needed to build America. I mean, the White House was built on the back of enslaved people's, you know, sort of work. So, you know, sort of, I think, you know, sort of class is so different in the UK to the US, and it is race specifically that defines oneself in the United States.
And defines your class in a way, you know.
Yeah,
race defines your class, yes.
Yeah,
and so
yeah, but also, you know, sort of gender, you know, so we've talked, you know, sort of both papers talked about Black women, and, you know, sort of, and, you know, sort of, and you three are, you know, sort of brilliant Black female intellectuals, but thinking about, you know, sort of the Black women who have been murdered by, you know, sort of police brutality, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, you know, sort of, and, you know, sort of thinking about the justice for them, you know, sort of, we're always apt to, you know, sort of think about police brutality against Black men, but actually, you know, sort of thinking about the ways in which Black women have also been treated by the police is, you know, sort of worthy of, you know, sort of so much attention. And, you know, sort of, I'm sure you're aware of projects like Say Her Name. And so, you know, sort of, but this conversation really needs to start in, you know, sort of schools, you know, sort of where, you know, sort of in the US and in the UK, where, and in Europe actually, whereby, you know, sort of our school children are not being educated about, you know, sort of slavery, about, you know, sort of those sorts of things. And you've said already that, you know, sort of in Texas, you know, sort of the history of slavery has been, you know, sort of wiped off the curriculum. So, you know, sort of thinking about where this knowledge starts, where the kind of the hegemonic powers and the structures are created, it's through education, but even, you know, sort of within, you know, sort of primary schools upwards. Primary is our, you know, sort of first schools. So yeah, I think, you know, I've got, you know, sort of loads to say. I could talk all afternoon about this, but it's just like it doesn't kind of merit a response, but, you know, sort of just sort of some scattered thoughts as I, you know, sort of was writing furiously in my notes. Thank you.
Well, Becky, doesn't it go back to the point that we were talking about earlier about how optimistic we should be? I'm just thinking, you know, I was at school quite a long time ago now, but I had no awareness from school that, say, in a British context, things like all the aristocratic homes up and down the country were largely built through profits from slavery. But now, if you go into most of these houses, it's up there. You know, it hits you, and there's a kind of admission that right very prominently. I'm just thinking about somewhere I visited this summer that said this house was built because of the slave trade. And the owners were, or the ancestors of the owners were complicit in all this.
But the woman who's organised this project has received death threats because, you know, sort of how dare she kind of sully the name of these, you know, sort of philanthropists, and, you know, so, you know, sort of there's white allyship, but there's also still racism is alive and well in the UK.
Oh, well, I have no doubt about it, but I mean, I think it's less institutionally approved, at least in a kind of overt sense. You know, even Boris Johnson, although he's made some appalling racist statements in the past, I mean, he would distance himself in a way that Trump doesn't seem to, for example, from these statements.
Could I say something positive as well about the education side of things? I mean, when I went to school, we would never have been taught about African-American slavery in any sort of way whatsoever. But I was practicing this talk earlier, and I went out just before the talk, about half an hour before, to walk my dog. I came back to find my daughter had left this Good Night Stories for Rebel Girls. She'd left this and she'd left, she said, turn to page 64. I was thinking what she's talking about. She'd left a reference to page 64 to Harriet Tubman. So, and she'd said that, I said, you know of Harriet Tubman? She said, yes, we learned about him at school last term. And I was surprised in a positive sense that, you know, school children in the UK are being taught about these things. So it was a positive surprise for me to think that.
Good.
I mean, when I was in school, just since everybody's I mean, the way we were taught about anything to do with the slave trade was it was essentially a discourse of white saviorism. You know, Wilberforce was the white savior, and that any change that occurred was down to white people. So whether it was that individuals had a conscience or whatever the story was, but the narrative arc was the white savior coming in.
And one of the things that was omitted, and I didn't know until really quite just a few years ago, that the British slave owners got massive compensation from the government that taxpayers have been paying back until just a few years ago. I mean, it's just remarkable. And that's just, as far as I know, was completely written out of...
and enslaved people got nothing in the Caribbean.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So just like, yeah, compensated for your loss of labour, but no, not compensated for your actual labour.
No, it was the people who were millionaires anyway who got compensated for losing property, essentially.
Yeah. And I guess again that plays into kind of the hegemonic structures of power, because you know, sort of who were these peoples? Well, they were, you know, sort of David Cameron's ancestors, and you know, sort of I don't know, sort of other people's ancestors actually who, you know, sort of are now high up in the echelons of you know, sort of British government. So yeah, it really kind of plays on that, you know, sort of structures of hegemony that we've been focusing on, I think.
Yeah, so we've just lost Myrtle. I think she had to go. So, but for fear of losing people, before we can say thank you, we say thank you to Joy and Daphne in particular for doing the talk. That's fantastic. And I think
very much
really inspiring.